Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Keith Jones. I'm Director of the Institute of Civil Engineers. Welcome to the 19th Wales National Flooding Conference. And this conference is organised by ICE Welsh Cymru in partnership with the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, supported by Welsh Government and in conjunction with Natural Resources Wales and Cardiff University. The conference is sponsored by ADAP, Atkins, Binnies, JBA Consulting and Waterco, and we'd like to thank them for their generous support. ICE Welsh Cymru is keenly aware that Wales flooding and risk management is particularly relevant and topical. The flooding events across the UK and Wales this year and last year, in fact year on year, appear to be indicative of climate change, and therefore looking to the future, flooding is likely to become increasingly prevalent. Without appropriate flood risk planning and management, there can be serious or indeed tragic consequences of flooding. And it's important for us as experts, if you like, to inform the Welsh public of these consequences and be strong advocates of the best methods of flood risk management and resilience. We must change the way the flooding is viewed. We here in Wales must ensure that the people of Wales are adequately informed of flood prevention and mitigation measures that can effectively plan for the possibility of flooding. Now I'd like to warmly welcome Julie James, Minister for Climate Change. A little bit about Minister, just before we start. Julie James was born in Swansea, but spent significant portions of her youth living around the world with her family. She spent an early career in London and then moved back to Swansea with her husband to raise 3 children and to be closer to family. Minister is a committed green campaigner, environmentalist, and a keen swimmer and skier. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to the Minister. Minister.
Diolch, Keith. Bore da pawb. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to open this year's National Flooding Conference. As the new Minister for Climate Change, I feel I've taken on this vital role at a very pivotal moment. The previous 18 months have indeed laid bare the stark reality that faces us in Wales. The climate emergency is here. Severe weather events are happening more frequently and we need to adapt. That is the reason why this government has created a new climate change ministry, to give us the power to do more and to make significant changes. It almost goes without saying, but these are testing times for communities across Wales. February 2020 brought us some of the worst flooding witnessed for a generation. Thousands of homes were flooded and communities devastated, but it didn't stop there. Summer downpours brought further misery to communities, and the most recent winter saw yet further flooding. All of this against the backdrop of an international pandemic. But I also see so many reasons for optimism. The resilience our communities have shown in the midst of such challenging times is quite remarkable. Our risk management authorities and their contractors have worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the floods, repairing damaged infrastructure and doing their utmost to keep communities safe. The Welsh Government response was swift and substantial. Since February 2020, we have provided nearly £9 million in funding to local authorities and to NRW. This has paid for repairs to our flood and drainage infrastructure, making improvements where necessary to reinstate or improve the protection they give to communities. The Welsh Government provided 100% of the costs incurred as we sought to provide reassurance to communities devastated by these events. Moreover, our sustained investment has proved its worth, with recently completed schemes working well and keeping us safe despite record rainfall and river levels. Over the past 18 months, I've been pleased to see how well our risk management authorities work together, not only in undertaking their investigations, but delivering improvements to those communities affected. I want to see this kind of collaborative working continue as we step up our engagement and delivery in reducing flood risk all across Wales. This collaboration extends beyond our risk management authorities, especially where they deliver wider environmental and infrastructure benefits. Our priority will, of course, always be our communities, but flood schemes are ideally placed to deliver multiple economic and environmental benefits. Transport and utility providers are likely to benefit and support such work, and as we plan ahead, we can align funding programmes to get better value from our combined investment. This government is working hard to secure extended funding packages, which, alongside your project pipelines, will present us with shared opportunities and help us join up on resilience and adaptation. When it comes to communication, the most important stakeholders remain the communities we are seeking to help. We have made it clear in our national strategy how we expect risk management authorities to communicate effectively. We must have open and frank conversations with residents and businesses to help them understand the risks they face. The better we all understand risk, the more resilient we are. We often talk about having difficult conversations, but are we having them? We need to get into communities and show how we will improve their standard of protection, how we can adapt to climate change, how we will support them and keep them safe. Our digital engagement has made great strides in this last year, but people still need to see us, especially after they've been affected by flooding. We need to step up our engagement and outreach and talk more. And yes, there are difficult areas to defend, and it is not only coastal areas that are at heightened risk. Climate change brings an increased likelihood of flooding from surface water and rivers. We need to be working with communities to plan for their future, especially in those areas which face significant risks. We will continue to support communities facing adaptation. Some will require greater protection, others may need to move back to a safer location. These decisions will be made by closely monitoring evolving evidence and working with local authorities, delivery partners, and most importantly, the people who live and work there. Following May's election, we published our programme for government. We have committed to an ambitious target to fund flood protection for more than 45,000 homes. We will also deliver nature-based flood management in all major river catchments, expanding wetland and woodland habitats in the process. These commitments signal our intent to deliver. We are supporting it with record levels of investment, allowing more schemes and more resources to be put in place. This year alone, we will invest over £65 million across Wales to support those living at risk of flooding and coastal erosion. Our coastal risk management programme will also see multiple significant schemes commence this year to reduce current and future risks to our communities. It includes schemes in Cardiff, Swansea, Aberystwyth, Aberdyfi and Penrhyn Bay in Conwy. This is a clear message from government that we will not accept flooding to homes as the new normal. We will plan carefully and invest in the right places to reduce risk and mitigate against the effects of climate change. This time last year, we published an ambitious new national strategy for flooding and coastal erosion in Wales, the first in nearly 10 years. The strategy is improving how we work together to reduce risk, providing the direction required through clear objectives and measures. It is focused on delivering improvements, better communication, more natural solutions and catchment approaches, clarity over responsibilities and collaboration across all parties, improved mapping of risks and assets, preventing future risk by strengthening planning policy, stronger pipelines and acceleration of flood schemes. The strategy isn't just about aspirations. It has set numerous measures by which its success can be judged. Many have already been met. We have published the Wales Flood Map, which shows the latest data on flood risk and coastal erosion, with information on assets coming in 2022. We are delivering coastal surveys to inform future shoreline management decisions. We have launched our fully funded natural flood management programme. We are not just talking about change, we are delivering it. One of the most significant milestones from our strategy is the launch of our updated planning guidance around flood and coastal risk. The new TAN 15 was developed alongside the national strategy, complementing and strengthening our flood policy. Both are focused upon addressing the risk posed by climate change. They recognise the existential threat it poses to our communities. As our climate changes, the patterns of flooding and coastal erosion around Wales are changing and getting worse. Extreme events are happening more often. Our strategy acknowledged that flooding is not just about rivers and the sea. We placed renewed emphasis upon the risks associated with surface water flooding and coastal erosion. Now, for the first time, the scope of TAN 15 has been widened to include the risk associated with surface water, smaller watercourses, drainage and coastal erosion. New developments in Wales will be safer as a result. TAN 15 is accompanied by a new flood map for planning. We believe Wales is one of the first countries in the world, and certainly in the UK, to make planning decisions using a flood map which incorporates climate change and shows future risk. This is because the new TAN 15 is focused upon the future, specifically the well-being of future generations. It will be crucial to developing a more resilient Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities and a globally responsible Wales. As part of our mapping improvements, NRW have also published a new Check Your Flood Risk service. Households now have a quick and easy way of checking the risk to their home from rivers, the sea or surface water. This tool has been published as part of our wider Wales Flood Map package, providing our most accurate assessment of flood risk ever. They will help the public to understand the risk to their homes and communities, as well as inform our development decisions. These maps must also demonstrate where our investment is benefiting communities and reducing people's flood and coastal risk. The strategy has a key measure which ties our Wales Flood Map products to the management of our assets, so the public can see how our work and investment is making a difference to them. NRW will be publishing the National Asset Database in 2022 and aligning all future asset updates to the Wales Flood Map products. These updates will happen every 6 months, meaning the maps and the decisions they inform will always remain up to date. I'm very pleased to update you this morning on the ongoing success of our Natural Flood Management Programme. This supports a key government commitment and the clear stance taken in our national strategy. Our business case guidance also sets out how natural flood management measures must be considered for every scheme we develop. I understand how this is a step change for many of us, and we are still learning. That is why we are supporting our risk management authorities with 100% grant support and £3 million funding. We have 15 projects underway which will be monitored closely so as to share good practice and encourage more natural alleviation projects elsewhere. As a learning opportunity, it has already shown many of the challenges associated with doing things differently, particularly during a pandemic. However, it is providing excellent examples of working in partnership with communities, landowners, and other organisations. It's also demonstrating how such projects not only reduce flood risk, but provide wider environmental and societal benefits. For these reasons, I have agreed to extend this programme for another year to enable us to fully meet these challenges and deliver schemes which provide the maximum possible benefit. Our new strategy, planning guidance, and flood and coastal programmes are delivering change and setting the direction for future ways of working. There is more to come, with the Flood and Coastal Erosion Committee exploring ways to improve the legislation we work within and seeking new ways to support our work and bolster resources. As the climate changes, we must all adapt. Your expertise in flood and coastal risk management has never been more important to society than it is today. With your help, we will deliver significant change, reducing risk to thousands of homes and doing so in a way which improves people's lives and their wider environment. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. Now I'd like to take questions if you use the Q&A function. But as the Chair's prerogative, I could ask you the first question, Minister. You talked about priorities. Perhaps you can say your number one priority, Minister.
So that's a really difficult question, actually, Keith, because it's really hard to boil it down to a single priority. We've got quite a lot of things to do. So we'll be publishing our net zero plan on the 28th of October, just ahead of COP. Our big priority is to make sure that that plan gets us to net zero by 2050 and that we meet all the milestones along the way. And in doing that, we also want to, not only do we want to make sure that we reduce our emissions as a nation, but also that we do it globally. So we look at our patterns of consumption, our deforestation around the world, and also our biodiversity. So it's quite a big thing, very difficult to say a single thing, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Stunned everybody into silence, Keith.
Exactly right. There was a question there, but it's disappeared. Let's look at the published questions. Here we go. The new 1015 established strict and rigid policies against development in flood risk areas. Therefore, what support will be given to communities that find large areas of existing development blighted by these policies, with an inability to transition or adapt to climate change due to development planning constraints? For example, large areas close in Newport are particularly important. Any comments in relation to that, Minister?
Yeah, so it's important to realise that TAN 15 is part of a suite of planning tools. It's not just standing on its own, and it comes as part of the general planning system. So you'll still be able to have, you know, the old bits of TAN 15 are still there. So you can still, if you can, justify the risk that you're taking and show mitigations against it. The idea of TAN 15 is to direct development towards brownfield, away from greenfield. So as long as you've got your infrastructure in place and so on, then you ought to be able to put mitigation measures in place in order to still develop brownfield sites, particularly in city centres. I've also encouraged all the councils and council leaders to come forward with adaptations to the flood maps. Not all our councils responded to the consultation. So if they have problems with the way that the flood maps look and they have evidence to show that they should be changed, then they should come forward with that. There is a challenge process for that incorporated into the plans.
Thank you. Another question. Improving defence is laudable. However, some of the most difficult areas are where we need to relocate or decommission communities. Since climate change is so different, do we need new concepts for funding, including compensation to allow relocation? We are familiar with one particular area, but we won't talk about that now. Just talk in general, please, Minister.
Yeah, so that's a real big problem, isn't it? So we obviously need to take the communities along with us. We need to have long conversations with them about, you know, their risk, what that looks like, what the future of their community is, what would happen if we did move them from there, how we would assist them to do that, and so on. I mean, there's no doubt at all that some of our communities, that it's just actually very nearly impossible to protect them. That's the truth of it. No amount of money that you put into it is going to stop the erosion. So we must work with those communities and make sure that that transition is as easy as it can be made for those residents. Not to say that it will be easy, of course, it will be not easy at all, but we must work with the communities to make sure that we take everything that they need into account. So, nothing's off the table in doing that. We will want to talk to the residents about how that can be managed.
Thank you. Question about TAN 15. New TAN 15 appears to preclude large areas from potential industrial and economic development in flood zone 3 without site-specific assessment of risk. What's the justification for this, Minister?
So it's an indication, as I said. So, if you do a site-specific risk analysis, then it's inside the planning system. So if you can justify taking the risk, or you can show that your site has specific, drainage arrangements or mitigation measures or whatever, then you can still go ahead. But there's a presumption. And the presumption is a right presumption, isn't it? We can't just go on building on our floodplains and then go, oh, dearie me, they've all flooded afterwards. We just can't keep doing that. And as I say, the TAN 15 is very specifically directing development away from greenfield and into brownfield. So if your site is already developed, then the thing to do is to look at the justification measures, make sure that your drainage systems are in place, look to see what flood mitigation is on the river or coast that you're looking at, and then come forward with your plans accordingly adjusted. But what we can't do is just continue to build on areas of Wales we know will flood, and then, as I say, wring our hands when they do flood.
Thank you, Minister. Could we ever build on floodplains in future going forward? Is that ever the case?
I think this is the whole point of what I was saying about the natural flood defences. So, there are several rivers in Wales that already benefit from natural flood defences. So that's spillage areas, reed beds, and so on. There's a brilliant one in just north of my constituency in Swansea on the Tawey, for example. That will protect the downstream floodplain to some extent. And then it's a question, I'm not an expert in this, it's a question for expertise from your institute and otherwise, Keith, to tell people who are coming forward to try and develop closer to the mouth of that river below the flood defences, whether that is a justifiable thing to do or not. So the mitigation that's been put in place ought to provide some kind of arrangement. But having said that, if it's never been built on before, then I would say that we should not be building on a floodplain. This is for brownfield sites. And of course, you'll be aware that across Wales, our big cities are built on the coast on river mouths. That's where people build them. So, we will have to have those mitigation measures in place, because otherwise the whole centre of Swansea, for example, is called Sandfields for a reason. So we have to have those mitigation measures in place. And indeed, you'll know that there's a big coastal defence across the front of Swansea, as there is in Cardiff, as there is in Newport. So this is all about working with our mitigation measures and our cities to make sure that we are resilient for the future.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, I live in Cardiff and I've seen the marks on the church down on the Wentwood levels, looking up at those marks of the terrible flooding in history. A couple more questions coming in now. TAN 15 and the new mapping and climate change allowances are very significant changes. Planning consents take many months to prepare. EIA and major applications determination periods exceed the 9 weeks notice period. Is there not a reasonable case to review or delay the lead-in beyond the current of all determinations on or after 1st of December?
Well, so this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because that's always the case. It's always the case that the lead, no matter when I choose, the lead-in is longer than it. And, this is about accepting that we have a big risk. So, absolutely, there will be some planning applications that are in the process who will be affected by the change. But that will be the case no matter when I choose, because if I chose a later date, the ones in the process now won't be affected. But the ones who are just coming on, the people who are about to submit today, they will be affected. So any date I choose is going to have that kind of problem. As I say, you need to make sure that your proposed development is resilient. And just because TAN 15 is changing and we are being stricter about it doesn't mean that people shouldn't have taken that into account. I cannot emphasize enough that we cannot have this gung-ho attitude to, oh, look, it'll be okay mostly. I mean, I've seen the devastation caused to businesses and people on the ground when their houses and businesses are flooded. These are things we must avoid.
Thank you, Minister. Question now on a slightly different topic. how is the need for replacing habitat loss, particularly coastal, is offset against the impact on people in the proposed areas?
So this is a good ongoing one. I'm very determined to make sure that we have a few exemplar sites around Wales where we can work with the best of our scientific community, our engineers and our communities surrounding the sites to make sure that we get the right balance, really. So I'm looking at a few exemplar sites. We'll be announcing them, I hope, soon, to work up the schemes that we need to replace biodiversity loss, to bring those sites back into good conservation, but also for people to be able to live and work around, you know, and make a living in those areas. So this is all about the balance, isn't it? I'm not yet, I'm afraid, Keith, at a point in time where I can make those announcements, but watch this space. We will be doing that soon.
Thank you, Minister. New questions have come in now. We've had some that are repeating, so we'll leave those out. The Check Your Flood Risk project is very welcome. It's a welcome addition to NRW's website. However, why doesn't this not communicated to future flood risk? Is there a link there needed?
I'm not sure about that. I'll have to ask one of my technical advisors on that one, Keith. I'm just the policy maker. So I imagine it's something to do with the data that we have, but I would have to ask one of my technical advisors to answer that. What I'll do, Keith, if there are answers of that, so James can do it for me, perhaps, if he's online. There we are.
James?
Yeah, happy to. So there's two distinct maps that's, you know, the kind of the landmark maps for under Wales flood map products. We got the Check Your Flood Risk, which is attached to Flood Risk Assessment Wales, which is the present day risk from all sources of flooding, and it includes coastal erosion, shows shoreline management plan policies. So it's the present day risk, so people can see exactly what's there in place today. The flood map for planning applies climate change projections to that. So that's excellent then for development decisions to see what is likely to be safe or less than safe over the next 50 to 100 years. So we've got two different maps doing two slightly different jobs. If you want to see the climate change ones, look at flood map for planning. If you need to know the current and present risk to your property or to your community, then that's Flood Risk Assessment Wales, which is then tied to the Check Your Flood Risk maps. NRW speaking after yourself, Minister, so I'm sure Ceri can add a little bit more to that if she wishes to.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James. Question now. It's great that you're investing in all the money into schemes, but will you also be investing in the LLFAs more to make sure that we have the resources to carry the schemes out?
Yeah, so this is about coming together with Team Wales, basically, across the piece, just to make sure that each part of Team Wales is doing the right thing. So, you know, we're doing a review of how exactly that works. There are a lot of players in this, so making sure that everybody is resourced to do their bit of it. We all know what that bit is, and we know how they link together is a very big part of my job, Keith. So that's basically, that is the essence of being the minister. I'm the person who gets the people around the table to discuss how these all link together and what resources need to go where to make sure we have the most effective response.
Thank you, Minister. Have a comment now. I don't know whether you wish to reply to the comment, but we'll try the comment. Flood remediation schemes are implemented to protect existing communities' businesses and must not be regarded as a means to intensify development in a risk area. The aims of TAN 15 is to direct development away from the risk areas, even though there will be areas which are developed subject to a satisfactory assessment of flood risk. It's a comment, not a question. I don't know whether you wish to follow up on it.
No, that's absolutely right. That's exactly right. It's there to direct development away from areas that are at flood risk, and specifically actually greenfield areas that are at flood risk, and to, you know, concentrate developers' minds on areas that are not at flood risk. Absolutely right.
Okay. The question says the Minister refers to developments being resilient and that TAN 15 is only a presumption. If this is planning guidance, then why won't Natural Resources Wales simply have to object to all developments that don't meet the published TAN 15 criteria?
Yeah, so it's, as I say, this is part of the suite of planning. You can't look at TAN 15 all by itself. So you have to look at the whole suite of planning tools available, including Planning Policy Wales and so on. So this is, this sits within the planning family of legislation and advice notes. So it's very difficult in an answer like this to give a technical answer. I'm a recovering planning lawyer, Keith, so I probably need about 2.5 hours to answer that question in any detail. But the trick is to make sure that you don't read TAN 15 in isolation. Thank you, Minister. Good answer. Dealing with flood risk is long term needs to be dealt with in the upper catchment. You touched on this in your speech. Trim funding is being allocated to natural flood risk management schemes. Will this funding increase to help local authorities implement future schemes? As these types of schemes are relatively new to most RMAs, what guidance or support will be offered to help the RMAs implement schemes? Yeah, so that's a really difficult question. We're stuck, I'm afraid, in the budget rounds that the UK government is currently carrying out, the comprehensive spending review you'll all be familiar with and so on. And we're still in an annual budget cycle. So it's, I would very much like to be able to give multi-annual indications to schemes of this sort, but unfortunately that's not been possible because of the way our budget works. We really hope that after the comprehensive spending review, we will be able to give multi-annual budget projections for schemes of this sort. We will obviously, as these are new things, we will be monitoring them closely, lessons learned and so on, and then helping partners learn those lessons and spread the good practice across Wales. Thank you. Question from Richard. We now have a name question, which is really great. TAN 15 2021 clearly states that development will only be justifiable in flood zone 3 if considered to be in the interests of national security, energy security, public health, or to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Clearly, this will not include any commercial or industrial development, regardless of previous site uses or mitigation measures. Therefore, flood zone 3 areas are effectively undevelopable. Are we misinterpreting this? Yes, it's a short answer to that. Thank you. Let's see if we get another one. Question for Simon. Thank you for the funding has been provided going forward. Could we consider looking into funding streams to work with schools and local groups to educate on flood risk and climate change, installing rain gauge, for example, in schools, essentially areas where flooding hasn't occurred, but by improving flood education in schools, it will help the resource gaps in the industry. Teach them, catch them young and teach them. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of that, as you know, Keith, from working with me over the years. I've been discussing with my colleague Jeremy Miles, the Minister for Education, what we can do in terms of climate change tuition across schools, and that obviously includes flood risk and so on, but adaptation measures in general and also mitigation measures. So we're very keen to make sure that we get that kind of learning, proper technical learning into the schools as early as possible. Thank you. Really good answer and support exactly what you're saying there. Question for Anne-Marie. We are aiming towards carbon zero in Wales, as you mentioned, of course. Are there any plans for FCERM schemes or developments to require a carbon assessment? And this is done in England, for example? Yeah, so the details in our net zero plan will be coming out on the 28th of October. So despite enticements to tell you in advance what's in there, I watch the space. But obviously there are, we have to have a baseline against which we're measuring ourselves, and we have to have tools by which to measure them. Thank you. Yes, I've registered, of course, for that. So looking forward to that. Question from Brian. If TAN 15 should not be used in isolation, what other standards and documents should be referred to deal with flooding? So there's a whole suite of documents available for planning, and as I say, you need to read, unfortunately, the whole lot. So consult your local planning lawyer, I guess, is the answer to that. No, quite seriously, Keith, in bringing a development forward, you have to consider a range of things, including the flood risk of the area in question. And the first thing that anybody should think in bringing a development forward is, could I do this somewhere else? If this is a high risk TAN 15 area on the map, the first thing you should ask yourself is this appropriate at all, or should we be going somewhere else? If there are other reasons why the development really can only go ahead there, then you have to go through all of the other issues that you need to go through. And it may well be that it's not possible anyway, but there are a range of things you then need to consider. Thank you. Question from Tim.
Can you please advise what standard of protection the Welsh Government wants for our communities, being mindful that the February 2020 floods were in excess of the 1 in 200 annual probability, overtopping defences that currently provide 1 in 100 year protection?
Well, exactly. And, I'm not, I emphasize here, I'm not the technical advisor or the scientist or the engineer. I'm getting advice off the best people that we have to advise us about what our policy should be. And that's why we're bringing TAN 15 forward in the way that it is. And, that's why we've been looking at the flood and coastal defences right across Wales over the last 18 months to just look at exactly that. And you'll be aware that last winter, some of our defences held, but only just. They were within centimetres of topping in some places in Wales. So we really do need to look very hard at what we consider to be a severe weather event. And I'm afraid what's become much more normal and commonplace. And we need to be able to up our game, don't we, to make sure that communities are protected against those.
Absolutely, totally agree. Thank you, Minister. Question for Emily. Will there be a greater need to communicate NRW's role and remit and the role of riparian owners? For example, Natural Resources Wales have permissive powers, and then are rules and responsibilities of the riparian owners, which play a role in protecting people against flooding.
Yeah, so it's not a question, it's a statement of fact, and I completely agree with it. And as I said, my job is to make sure that I get the right people around the table for others in order to have those discussions. So with the riparian owners, well, with the owners in general of the developable sites, with the Crown Estates, the coastal authorities, and so on, to just make sure that we're all pulling in the right direction and we're using our resources in the best possible way.
Thank you, Minister. That ends the questions, unless we have another question. Perhaps if there are no more questions, remind you if you have a last opportunity. Now just over a minute or so to go, so we have a final question. We have a question, and we'll just check it out now. Question from Brian. What are the policies in regards to future-proofing the existing infrastructure, specifically waterways, dealing with flooding itself?
So I didn't catch that, Keith. Sorry, say it again.
Sorry. Okay, I'll speak a little slower. Thank you, Minister. What are the policies in regards to future-proofing the existing infrastructure? Specifically, the question is referring to waterways and how to deal with flooding. Yeah,
so that's all the stuff that we've just talked about. So these are the various maps, the coastal flood and coastal risk programs that we're running, and the strategy that I talked about in my speech. So there's a raft of different policies depending on where you are and what your risk is across Wales. So I'm sure one of the officials later on in your conference will be able to list them for you if that's what's required, but they're all on the websites.
Thank you, Minister. Well, I think that closes your session as we have no new questions. So on behalf of the steering group of the Welsh National Flooding Conference, thank you, Minister, and thank you for your very full replies and taking the questions today. Thank you.
Pleasure, Keith. I hope you have a good conference. Bye now.
Okay. Now I'd like to pass on to our next speaker. We have Ceri Davies, Natural Resources Wales Executive Director of Evidence, Policy and Permitting. Ceri is normally based in Cambria in Cardiff, but works all over Wales. She works in Natural Resources Wales since April 2013. She has a BSc in Chemistry and Biochemistry and is a member of the Chartered Institute of Waste Management, although shortly working with her on becoming a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I'm looking forward to that. Her career to date spans over 27 years at both private and public sector organisations with considerable and significant experience. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Ceri. Ceri.
Lovely, thank you very much, and hopefully you can hear me okay. So in terms of the presentation today, I wanted to start with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report issued earlier this year and the clear message that urgent action is to be taken now. I felt that these pictures on this slide were a great summary of the key points, the key takeaways, if you like, from that report, each one illustrating the scale of the issues and the challenges and the fact that we need to adapt. The changes are widespread, rapid and intensifying. Extreme weather events events will be more frequent and more severe. There's no going back for some systems, but we can work to save others. The changes will increase, and the need for immediate action to limit further change is necessary right now. So the takeaway message is that we need to act now to decarbonise, to mitigate carbon emissions, and we need to adapt too. The UN Secretary General summed it up quite simply, saying that code red for humanity. And there's been a lot of talk about climate change mitigation and adaptation, but as has been said recently by people such as Greta Thunberg, Prince Charles, Prince William, and even the Queen when she was in Cardiff last week, the time for talking is gone and the time for action is now. So today I want to share some of NRW's work that we're doing that represents the action that we're taking. So to start off with, I want to cover our carbon positive project. To be able to manage approaches, you need to understand what you're dealing with. So we undertook a carbon positive project to evaluate our carbon footprint, and for example, it identified that our peatland emissions dwarfed the rest of our operational emissions by approximately 2.5 times. So that was a key priority for us to look at restoration of peat. The project has gone on to identify a wide range of mitigation options across our buildings, across our transport, across procurement and land management. It's important to understand all of the parts of your net carbon status, and also to understand the embedded emissions. 59% of our carbon footprint is through the goods and services that we procure. So the Carbon Positive project also played an important role in the Welsh Government's guidance for the public sector in our aim to help achieve the target of a carbon neutral public sector by 2030. So you'll see from this slide that our net zero position is secured, because obviously we can look at that against the NRW estate. But the NRW estate isn't there just to provide the offset for NRW's work. It's also there to help the public sector to achieve that net zero by 2030. So we have a huge role to continue in trying to reduce our carbon emissions, to improve the opportunities on the estate and our nature reserves to sequester and store carbon, and to provide leadership across the public sector so that others can learn from the work that we've done. So after the climate emergency declaration, we developed a programme of priorities for NRW of action that we were going to take across land management and restoring ecosystems, developing technological changes to electrify our fleet, to increase renewable generation and to adapt low carbon heating buildings. We've put in place a behavioural change programme, which is encouraging our staff to take more action around sustainable travel, reducing commuting through hybrid working, but also the cultural changes through a better understanding of climate change and its impacts, and developing carbon literacy training for our staff. We're trying to mainstream action on climate across all of our work so that every part of our organisation and every one of our employees thinks about carbon in the work that they're doing. Alongside decarbonisation, obviously we need to understand the need for adaptation. Storm Dennis showed the impacts and the reality of more frequent and more extreme weather events. The review reports that we published about this time last year included a report on the land estate management practices, recognising the link between land management and flood, and how we need to manage our land to reduce flood impacts. The reports concentrated on what NRW needs to do to better manage flood incidents, but also contains some key messages about the need for us all to change across all sectors and all stakeholders and communities. And I think this time last year at this event, our chief executive called for a seismic shift in our thinking. We need to think and act differently, making space for water in how we do spatial planning and in how we manage whole catchments. Thinking about NRW's wider role, obviously with the benefit of the Welsh Government woodland estate, planting trees is a key element of how we both mitigate and adapt. Mitigate because they capture carbon, adapt because they have a role to play in increasing water infiltration and evapotranspiration. And so they are a key nature-based solution. They're also good for biodiversity and our response to the nature emergency too. Our Woodland Program is made up of 7 elements, and on this slide you can see those, ranging from extending the Welsh Government woodland estate for woodland creation to supporting the plant scheme, where we plant a tree for every child born or adopted in Wales, and support for other landowners with improved access, provision and guidance and support to plant trees on their land too. We need to be working with others to encourage much more tree planting across the estate, but also on farms and in our urban centres. Much of the programme is an enabler, facilitating delivery of woodland creation by others. We've been working also with the Welsh Government to identify the barriers to planting and to deliver actions to make the changes needed via the recent ministerial deep dive into timber and trees. Peatland Restoration is key. I mentioned earlier that it dwarfs our other emissions by 2.5 times. So a key mechanism to reduce carbon emissions significantly, but also, as I've mentioned earlier, linking into that biodiversity emergency and looking at water retention. In the first year of the 5-year National Peatland Action Programme, we've restored more than 750 hectares of peatland, with the intention to restore around 600 to 800 hectares per year. But it's important to recognise the scale of the challenge over the coming decades, as set out in the UK Committee on Climate Change, challenging us to restore all of our peatlands. The programme emphasises partnership working to ensure that the circa 4% of Wales landscape which is represented by peatland is restored or managed and maintained to ensure that it's got the best chance of carbon storage. While woodland creation and peatland restoration are the principal habitats that can help deliver decarbonisation, it's been increasingly recognised that the marine environment can play a role too, and in particular blue carbon. However, we found that the evidence base was weaker, so we commissioned research to understand the current carbon storage and sequestration within coastal, marine and intertidal habitats around the Welsh coast, and assessing the potential for both increasing carbon sequestration along with evaluating remaining evidence gaps. This infographic contains some important information, and I'm sure we can share the work that we've done on this through this conference. This work, like the carbon positive calculation I mentioned earlier, forms the basis for informed action to both protect the existing blue carbon resource and deliver additional habitats such as salt marshes or seagrass beds. Our changing climate challenges the stability of many of our hill slopes, and our legacy extractive industries, coal and metal and quarrying, have left some very high-risk waste tips which are vulnerable to climate change. The picture shows at the top Storm Tylerstown, which was affected by Storm Dennis and saw 60,000 tonnes slip from the top of the hill down into blocking the river. Massive remediation costs estimated at 82 million, and it's worth knowing that there are approximately 2,500 spoil tips in Wales, with some 300 of these deemed as high risk, of which around 80 are needing urgent works. We are working with the Coal Authority, with local authorities and Welsh Government to develop a protocol to aid rapid assessment and delivery of the solutions to reduce the risks at these sites. I thought it was also worth mentioning the situation at CIWEM last year, where infiltration of below ground shafts and old workings caused flooding within that area, with 80 people being evacuated. And again, those of you who are close to NRW will know that we spend time also looking at remediation of metal mines across Wales. Our reservoir regulation is another area where we're changing our practices to reflect the threats from climate change in future. The top left picture shows the spillway at Toddbrook in Whaley Bridge in 2019. A key point to emerge from that breach is that compliance with the regulations is not the same as ensuring safety. The reservoir has, up until that point, had a clean bill of health from the regulators, but it still failed. So this has led us to question the regulatory regime and whether enough is being done in the face of climate change. In Wales, we've got more stringent targets for reservoirs that require regulation, and what we're looking at is what we need to do with those operators to ensure that safety for regulated reservoirs in Wales. And that amounts to around 370 reservoirs, of which 35 of those are operational on the Welsh Government woodland estate. Excuse me. So we've invested more resource into this area and are looking to go beyond compliance, managing risks down to the minimum level. And the Minister mentioned earlier, and there was a question earlier around areas such as Fairborn on the slide on the left, which has been subject to many talks in the past, where we are working with others on adaptation measures with partners, with Gwynedd County Council, colleagues and with the community. But that's not the only area. We're at the early stages of working on coastal adaptation plans for other locations around Wales. And the screenshot on the right is the Davies estuary. This isn't about both, this is about the estuary elements where there are defences but not many properties to be defended. But there are other important habitats such as Borth Bog. It raises the question about what's the right long-term strategy in places like this in the face of possibly 1 metre of sea level rise over the next century. We have started this work and we're committed to do more of it in collaboration with partners and in collaboration with communities. So we've mentioned so far nature-based solutions and have an important place in managing flood risk going forward, and also in responding to the nature emergency. So the slide shows a couple of examples. The first is the salt marsh that's being created at Cwm Ivy on the North Gower coast. And the evolving salt marsh there. It's been controversial and it's been difficult, and there have been calls and there remain to be calls for reinstatement of the line of defence and the coastal path. But we've worked with partners on securing that salt marsh habitat and accepting the change as natural processes reclaim the area. These are difficult decisions, but they are decisions that need to be taken. The other half of the slide shows where we're implementing work to slow the flow. There's examples of leaky dams, of channel work that we've done on smaller watercourses. And I understand that there is a presentation later on in this conference about the work that we've done on natural flood risk management with Welsh Government. We've also been working closely with Welsh Government officials on the new agricultural bill to seek mechanisms for payments for farmers and land managers to enable opportunities for nature-based solutions on a farm scale and on a catchment scale. Another important area we've changed in Wales, and that's been the subject of many questions already, is the changes to the flood maps that are supporting the technical advisory note on development and flood risk TAM 15. So that was published recently. We produced the maps, as the Minister has said, which for the first time displays climate change scenarios. This is a huge significance and introduces those challenges for developers and planners, we know. But we believe it's the right thing to do so that we can make sure that the things that are developed going forward are sustainable. Another area where we're bringing forward changes on flood warning. We've made significant changes to how we display flood warning information and river levels online to make access to our information easier and quicker, so communities and partners can help themselves and better understand their own flood risk. This was a call from the review that we undertook last year following the flooding in 2020. We know that speed and accuracy of information is key in allowing others to respond to flood risk appropriately. Where we issue specific flood warnings, we're also focusing our efforts on the most serious warnings. So we'll be working hard on severe flood warnings and flood warnings to ensure that they are issued as quickly as possible. The flood alerts, which is the lower level of warning, will be issued with a more streamlined effort to ensure that we can concentrate on those extreme events and issuing warnings as quickly as possible. And of course, we will continue to deliver our programme of work, such as our capital flood risk programme, illustrated here with some examples. It's not all about flood defences, far from it. I've given you examples today from a range of areas across our responsibility. It's clear that we need to actively plan for and deliver adaptation on a local and on a catchment scale. The climate is changing rapidly and we need to be flexible in our approaches, including taking unpopular decisions at times. This is not just flooding or water management issues. It's much wider than that. It's spatial planning, it's community development, it's land management, it's marine management, and above all, it's communication. It's ensuring that we are getting our messages through and we're there to engage with and work with the communities affected. NRW is working in all of these areas, and we're currently developing a climate adaptation plan based on a systematic evaluation of climate risk to all aspects of our work, using the principles and approach within the new ISO 14090 adaptation standard. So I've given you a flavour of the action that NRW is taking to respond to the climate emergency, both across the breadth of our role and a few examples in flood risk management. The question we need to ask ourselves are, what am I doing and what is my organisation doing to respond to the code red for humanity? As I've mentioned earlier, as Greta Thunberg and the Queen just said last week, it's time for doing and not for just talking about it. Thank you and best wishes for the successful rest of conference. And if you can use those questions, keep them in your head as we continue through so that we continue to take the action that we need to take. Thank you very much. Keith, back to you.
Thank you, Ceri. Excellent presentation. What terrible images of flooding in Storm Dennis. So we'll come back to the questions at the end when we have a general session. I'd now like to introduce Councillor Ray Quant, MBE, the Deputy Leader of Caerdydd and County Council, who's speaking on behalf of the WLGA. So we'll point out to this point that Ray has advised that he has a little bit dodgy broadband, so we might have to switch to just a voiceover as we go forward. So a little bit about Ray Quant. Following a 40-year career in Royal Air Force, Councillor Ray Quant was elected as a local member of the Both Ward of Caerdydd Council in 2001. He has served on the Council's Cabinet since 2002 and as Deputy Leader since 2006. Ray, over to you. Ray, if you unmute.
Sorry, apologise everybody. Borrow that, everybody. Just to say, as the third speaker, obviously quite often things that you were going to say or are going to say have already been touched on, so you will have to excuse me if I do repeat some of the issues that have gone already. Emma Boyd, Chair of the Environmental Agency, in the speech last week made ahead of the COP26, warned the UK must adapt or die as flooding and droughts become more frequent due to climate change. And her clarion call was, so let's prepare, act and survive. Now, our approach in Wales is through partnership working, including Welsh Government, National Resources Wales, local authorities and others. And it reminds me of a three-legged stool. Each leg is important, but at times the stool becomes unstable, often leading to frustration, especially for local authorities. In February 2020, we experienced 3 severe storms within 4 weeks. That was Ceri, Dennis and Jorge, which resulted in extensive flooding. Over 3,000 properties and businesses were affected, and such dramatic events are attributed to climate change. NRW had implemented their flood warning system to alert areas of the approaching events, but the intensity of rainfall and storm surge simply overwhelmed many communities. Welsh Government promptly provided much needed help through the Discretionary Assistance Fund for households and the Emergency Financial Scheme for councils. Emergency services and risk management authorities, which includes councils, were stretched to the limit. Council staff worked relentlessly for weeks, cleaning up and providing much needed support to communities. Overall, it was the success story of joint support between the risk management authorities, whilst highlighting the need for clarity of roles and responsibilities in some areas, as the response is all too often left to council staff to take on. The severe weather conditions destabilised several spoil tips, leading to landslides, increasing the needs for spoil tips in many locations to be included in risk registers for severe storm events. Following the February storms, Council raised approximately 70 Section 19 reports under the Flood and Water Management Act, plus 80 capital flood mitigation schemes have been identified, which are being delivered following consultation with Natural Resources Wales and with Welsh Government funding. The events also triggered a myriad of investigations, assessments, and numerous schemes are likely to emanate from this, feeding directly into the Welsh Government's long-term pipeline of schemes. The estimated cost of the February 2020 floods is around £100 million, which does not include any future remedial works identified following the event. Welsh Government allocated £4.5 million emergency funding to councils for immediate repairs and £1.3 million to the general public through the Discretionary Assistance Fund. The latest Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change report states, "We have reached a crossroads where nations need to mitigate to reduce global temperatures and adapt to climate change and rising sea levels. This is at a time of reducing budgets, leading to cuts to public sector services, and raises the question of the inability to protect all communities in Wales, especially in low-lying coastal areas. At this time, we remain in the midst of a pandemic from which communities will need to recover. Councils are tackling climate change on two fronts, decarbonisation and adaption, where new policies and legislation are creating a range of challenges for councils and placing additional pressure on already depleted resources by developing climate change strategies. There is a need for different skill sets and knowledge to create a more rounded workforce, to increase the capacity available, and to work across a range of policy areas towards achieving statutory decarbonisation targets, which, whilst increasing community resilience towards mitigating against future major flood events. Capacity and availability of skilled workforce are becoming a real problem, both in terms of current vacancies which are not being filled, but also our long-term resilience to deal with increasing risk and emanating work streams linked with climate change. Councils have started to develop climate change strategies, which require services to work more inclusively together, but these require different skill sets and knowledge to create a more rounded workforce, able to work across a range of policy areas, including statutory decarbonisation targets, and to increase resilience, making communities across the country, rural and urban, less susceptible to external shocks in the future. Unfortunately, there will be a need to consider the future sustainability of some communities, because in addition to flood risk, there is the adaption agenda, which is broader than many realise, and this often affects coastal communities. It is important that partners work together, rather than in silos, progressing their own agenda, which can later create tensions between partners, especially if the outcome is to the detriment of a community, which in turn results in distrust towards authority by the community. More often than not, it is left to the local politicians to address the anger of the local population who feel let down. The following is an example to illustrate the point I make. The coastal community of Borth needed new sea defences for many years. Due to financial constraints, the scheme was to be carried out in 3 phases. Phases 1 and 2 were completed in 2013 at a cost of £18 million. And I have to say, Welsh Government, National Resources Wales and the local authority worked most effectively together. And Welsh Government pulled out all the stops to put the funding in place. The Council appointed consultants in 2019 to progress the outline business case for Phase 3, which abounds a golf course formed in 1885 between Borth and Llfas. Now, Phases 1 and 2 will hold the line, whilst Phase 3 is hold the line for 25 years, followed by managed realignment. The consultants concluded the main justification for implementing Phase 3 is safeguarding the railway embankment of the main railway line between Shrewsbury and Aberystwyth, on the part that runs across the bog between Llandovey and Borth, plus the highway between Borth and Llfas. The development of the outline business case and identified preferred solutions were all fully aligned with the management intent outlined in Shoreline Management Plan 2 for the frontage, in that it recognised the need to manage the coastline in a different way into the future, whilst also recognising that the community needs time to adapt to the change. Ceri actually put a map up earlier on, which actually goes to show really what the sort of area that we're dealing with. In June 2021, the Council was preparing to consult on 3 potential options, with a preferred option which aligned with Shoreline Management Plan 2. National Resources Wales attended meetings with our officers and consultants and were fully aware of the project details and proposals. However, just prior to commencing preparations for the consultation, Natural Resources Wales informed us that they had completed a strategic outline case in the area that includes the railway embankment across the bog, directly adjacent to our outline business case, and that they were moving that project towards the outline business case stage. Consequent to the National Resources Wales announcement, the Council has been asked by Natural Resources Wales to suspend its outline business case and public consultation and await the outcome of their outline business case. This delay and subsequent frustration could easily have been avoided had the Council been made aware and consulted on their work. Whilst it is recognised that climate change will impact on communities in many ways, nevertheless, connectivity and transport are also key to community sustainability. And in the example just given, what needs to be ascertained is the long-term viability of the railway line across the bog between Llandovey and Borth. There needs to be joint discussions between Welsh Government, Network Rail, National Resources Wales and the local authority, with Welsh Government taking the lead. The severe storms of 2020 highlighted the need for risk management authorities to better communicate and work together, as well as keeping the public informed. Whilst we need to work together to achieve a more resilient Wales, at times flood coastal erosion risk management roles and responsibilities can be a hurdle when local priorities do not align with national priorities, especially where projects identified by councils are not ranked high enough on the National Resources Wales National Programme of Work. There are times when councils take the lead in order to progress the development of schemes which are of local significance, or where National Resources Wales don't have the source to do so, which further blurs the line of roles of responsibilities and can create friction. Following the publication of a recent National Resources Wales review, the Welsh Local Government Association and Natural Resources Wales have worked closely to improve collaboration and communication at all levels, and we are in process of updating our joint Memorandum of Understanding. The Memorandum of Understanding will lead to a range of operational activity protocols, which will include flood and coastal erosion risk management, and the National Resources Wales Flood Review. In partnership with Welsh Government, protocol has been delivered for coal tip safety following the Tylers Town in South Wales landslip in February 2020. Such a protocol will enable urgent works to be undertaken. It is recognised there needs to be regular engagement at senior management level between the risk management authorities and it is planned to hold a joint summit before Christmas to consider the different challenges that arise under adaptions, resilience, flood, that's both inland and coastal, plus other impacted issues such as water and food security. We need a range of inclusive policies, funding mechanisms and investment in our workforce to enable councils to deliver a range of interconnected programmes and public services with our partners. The aim is to increase the resilience of our communities in Wales, to help their economy and well-being through mitigating and adapting to climate change. Our lives have changed dramatically over the course of the pandemic, and it is quite clear that local knowledge, innovation, resilience and adaptability has been fundamental to councils regarding responding to the crisis. It has also made us rethink how investment in local authority services can help the recovery process. This work is already underway, and the Welsh Local Government Association will work closely with all councils and National Resources Wales to develop a list of investment programmes focusing on green recovery, economy, housing and social care. This integrated approach considers nature and climate together as the foundation of economic, social and political renewal and regeneration in Wales, reflecting the focus of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act 2015. Diolch yn fawr I ti.
Thank you, Ray. As we move to an open discussion then, I'd like to first of all address the questions we have now. This question comes in from Angela. This is to Ceri. Following on from the difficult issue of potentially relocating coastal communities, when would you like to see community engagement start? There are currently varying approaches to very early in the outline case or later in the business case. Longest, shortest. Your views, Ceri.
I think as soon as possible, it's quite clear that we've learned as we've gone through that, the later in the business case development you engage, the more difficult it is. It is a long process, and people will come into that discussion at different stages. So starting very early on, starting with the evidence around the flood risk is key, because I think, again, we've learned from experience that not everyone will accept our sort of models and predictions. So, having that really open discussion around, this is the evidence that we've got, calling for evidence from others, so that we can bring all of that evidence together and start to talk in the round at the very earliest stage is the approach that we are now employing.
Thank you. Ray, any comments to that?
No, I appreciate what Ceri said, and let's hope things do move once they are.
Okay. At this point, James, I don't know whether you want to add any comments if you're still there in terms of early stage of consultation.
In complete agreement with Ceri, it's as early as possible. As Ceri said, people will come in and engage at different times themselves. So the Risk Management Authority and government should have that information ready and available for the public whenever they want to engage and whenever they want to come in. We need to be open and transparent about any kind of change and adaptation.
Thank you. It's a question from Greg, addressed to Ceri initially. Ceri, you highlight the importance of spatial planning, but would you agree that at present we still have a very siloed approach to funding, which on the coast no one having a remit for integrated coastal management is a problem?
Okay, and I think, the comments that have just been made as well around, the need for us to work together as flood risk management authorities at that very early stage, because often, the funding may well be siloed. It may well be that some of the duties and responsibilities of the flood risk management authorities are specific and particular. But, I think, as the councillor has as just outlined, you know, the need for us as flood risk management authorities to work together from the very earliest stages to identify where those gaps and challenges might be, so that we can, you know, work on those together and identify what the best approaches are. You know, there's never such a thing as a perfect system, because our systems, our legislation, our powers and duties and funding has developed over a period of time. And I think the important thing, and, you know, the message that I took from Ray's presentation is, you know, that absolute need for us to be talking together, because we might be one end of a process and the local authority might be the other, the water company might be in the middle. You know, the need for us as flood risk management authorities to call out to those others and start that engagement earlier. So it's a similar answer to the previous one, really. Start early, engage widely, be open and transparent, and be, you know, sort of adaptable to the sort of differences where there may be, you know, conflicts and issues around who've got powers and who's got money, but, you know, getting those on the table early and having a dialogue and discussion around how we take those forward is absolutely key.
Thank you, Ceri. Yes, I think the Minister referred to a Team Wales approach, which is really good. Ray, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I totally concur with what Ceri said, you know, and as I must make the point, generally we work very, very well with the Natural Resources Wales in our area, but this is just one of those things that's come up and we must make the point.
Absolutely. Anybody from Welsh Government wish to add anything at this point?
I think the Minister made her point very, very clearly, Keith, the importance of collaboration. Absolutely,
and having spent 40 years at local government, then absolutely behind the partnership approach is really great. So, question now from Greg, essentially to Ceri. You highlight the importance of spatial planning. Sorry, turn that one. Anonymous. What can we do more of, or do differently to support Natural Resources Wales to achieve your aims? And where do you think the biggest challenges are?
Okay, I'm not sure if, where that question came from, who the we is, but you know, all right, okay, okie dokie. You know, I think the thing for me is people being prepared to come forward. You know, not knowing where the comments coming from, but people being prepared to come forward and engage in the dialogue. You know, the earlier conversation around, you know, some of our experiences when we've been proposing things. You know, when things come in late in the day, you know, it makes it more challenging for everyone. But so I think early dialogue, you know, people coming forward and organisations coming forward where they may have, you know, resources through manpower, evidence or money to bring to the table is always welcomed. But, you know, being prepared to sort of put your head above the parapet and identify yourself as somebody who can help or somebody who's got an interest in things going forward. I think the other area for me, and you know, it was mentioned a couple of times through my presentation, but also by Ray, is, you know, the need to think of the climate emergency and the nature emergencies together, because, you know, these are, you know, absolutely fundamental to our well-being going forward, and whatever we do in one needs to be considered in relation to the other, so that we don't, you know, sort of take action in one as a consequence, a negative consequence of the other. So, you know, a key point for us is looking at where we can bring together, you know, those mechanisms, those interventions, those adaptations that will benefit both climate and nature, so that we're responding to both of those calls from government.
Thank you. Ray, what can we do different? What should we do different?
Well, for me to do it, I think talking is important, looking at each other's areas of responsibility, and also looking at each partner's difficulties in actually trying to achieve their goals, because we've all got difficulties, haven't we? And quite often they're financial constraints that actually mean that. So I think that we just need to make progress and carry on working together and deal with this thing. But coastal adaptation is going to be a very, very difficult issue. You know, you heard me relate to the fact that the golf club was formed in 1885, but even so, that's going to be a difficult one locally to deal with. But it's life, you know, you just got to get on and have to face reality.
James, what can we do differently? What should we do differently?
I think longer term and more strategic planning. And we've got a commitment in the strategy to publish longer term pipelines. So what we want to try and get to is a position where funding streams align in future. So we talk about collaboration and working together, but what would make it a lot easier is if we had better forward planning, so that local authorities, NRW, and the likes of people like Network Rail and water companies could come on board as well. So that there's true collaboration, but there's also it's easier when funding patterns align as well. So we can say what's going to be happening in 5, 6, 7, 8 years time, or even beyond that. So that's you know, a key ambition of the national strategy, to try and push that a little bit further. So we're not reactive. There's always going to be a need for some kind of reactive sort of positioning and funding, but in general our stance is that we should be planning for the future. We should be looking forward and reducing risk, but based on a fair and joined up understanding of risk. I don't think there's a comment in the side which says, you know, there's a siloed approach to working on a coast. I don't believe that. I think that there has been, you know, issues. There might be sort of like separate points in the past where people haven't talked as early as they should have, but I think this is improving all the time, that Team Wales approach. And one of the things we're going to be publishing soon is we're updating our grant memorandum to be a lot stronger on programme business cases, and that will foster a better approach to catchment management and full coastal management. So we're not just looking at individual, you know, stretches of river or individual parts of the coastline. We want to see local authorities and NRW working together on bigger, grander schemes across catchments and across stretches of coastline. So it's not just one risk management authority working on something. It could be 2 or 3 cross-border.
Keith, if I could nip in with another one that, you know, I think we've found useful is learning together as well. So, you know, I think James makes some fantastic points around, you know, more strategic planning together. But I think when we've implemented things, doing that learning together as well, so that we can continuously improve, we can look at the things that may have tripped us up or the things that went well, and we can do more of the stuff that went well, and we can then look at ways to tackle the things that might have tripped us up along the way. So I think that's something, because I think we tend to do our lessons learned separately as flood risk management authorities, and I think doing that together will bear more fruit.
Thank you, Ceri. In fact, the question came in originally as, what can we all do to support you? I was going to throw the question back to you. What do you need to do differently? And I think you've answered that question. Is there anything else you wish to say about what you need to do differently as NRW?
You know, it's going to sound much like the same. I think we need to be, you know, we need to be good at sharing our evidence and setting that out in a really good, accessible way to everyone, so that it's understood. You know, James used the terms transparent and open to debate and discussion and dialogue. I think often there's a perception that we come into it with a closed mind. We've already made our mind up, and we need to be really clear that, you know, that's not the case, that we're doing it in the interest of the environment and the protection of communities therein. So I think, you know, the way that we communicate, the way that we engage people, starting early, being open and transparent, and, you know, sort of, you know, bringing people into the conversation, you know, that they are all things that we have learned from, you know, sort of recent experience, whether it be on the coast or inland, with activities that we've undertaken. And, you know, and I think the other area, and hopefully that did come through in the presentation, is, you know, us looking across, and not just NRW now, but all public authorities, looking across all of their land assets to see, you know, what can they do by looking across their land assets to improve the situation, whether it be runoff, whether it be retention of water, whether it be, you know, sort of of if developments or other activities are on peatland, it's looking at those other cross-organisational opportunities to help the flood risk cause.
Thank you. We do have other participants on the panel, so if any of the other participants, Jeremy, Tom, Sarah, wish to chip in, then please feel to do so. I'm happy for you to stay in the dark, but if you do wish to contribute, now then the question is, what do we need to do differently? Jeremy, do you want to add anything?
Well, I wasn't expecting that, Keith. But yeah, I think first and foremost, the challenge is enormous, isn't it? And the adaptation challenge going forward is enormous. I think there's a point that strikes me that this is not just a flood risk management problem in isolation, and it's not just us who need to work in this in isolation. I think it's about, as Ceri said in her presentation, it's about water management, it's about land management, it's about the whole entirety. But what we've got to have is we've got to have those clear plans around adaptation. What are we going to do as things take hold and take bite? I think one of the challenges, and people have raised it in the comments in the side, is the quite frankly, the resources available to all of us to rise to that challenge. That is real, and that is there. What that means, therefore, is we've got to be smart, and we have got to work together well. And I think at times of pressure, sometimes maybe kind of even the opposite happens, that people sort of go a bit insular and they look at their own areas, and we've got to resist that. The picture I want to paint then is not one of naivety in terms of the scale of the sort of the challenge before us, but that's what we've got to respond to, and we're the best people to do so. I think there is a big thing in terms of catchment approaches and working on a catchment scale. If you take the floods that happen in the Taff area, you're not going to solve those by just looking at a part of it in isolation. If you build bigger defences, what does it do? It pushes the water downstream to the next community. So we do need to look at whole catchment areas. I think this whole concept of adaptive pathways is that the Environment Agency have sort of pushed and used. I think is a really interesting one, and one which I think we can all, let's not be proud about it. I think we can all utilise and we can all use. I think these are the things that we're doing. I think these are the things that we need to do more of as well. There was a question there from Northern Ireland colleagues about working with the agricultural sector. If you want to get in contact, Northern Ireland colleagues, with us at Natural Resources Wales, we can provide you with more information with that, and I'm sure Welsh Government would be keen to do so as well. But basically, it's an opportunity through the new agricultural bill that is Welsh Government have put a lot of work into to see what the opportunities are, and I link that in, everybody, because how we use the land is massively important in this whole picture. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you. I have a question now from Heather, who's asking, how about tax breaks for water neutrality? Any comments? James, let's go to you for that one. Tax breaks for water neutrality.
Could you expand upon the question?
Heather, more information, please. Okay, let's go to the next question.
Go back to that one.
Yes, question from Emily. Do the speakers agree that a lack of resource in local government renders collaboration difficult? Is this a consequence of low political priority given to FCERM? Ray, you might probably address to you first.
Well, it's come back to the point I touched on earlier on, doesn't it? We've all got our own issues to deal with when it comes to funding resources, and that's why collaboration work between the different authorities and the risk management authorities is so important. That's going to go on, and I'm sure following this conference that we will go forward with a renewed energy at this time to try to do better than we are doing, because at the end of the day we're all looking for the same thing, aren't we? We really want Wales to be the best, and we've all got to sort of safeguard our futures, particularly with all these troubling issues that are going on with regards to this. So I'm sure that we will work together, but resources will always be an issue, I'm sure.
Any comments from anybody else?
Yeah, I would absolutely support that. You know, I think we've found to our peril, probably both from a local authority point of view and NRW, and I'm sure the water companies also, that if you start off in that sort of more siloed approach, you then end up unpicking things later on, and that's more resource intensive. You know, it's more difficult to do. So it is about spotting those things early on, and as I said in my earlier response, you know, sort of being really open in that dialogue around what the challenges are for you each separately and how you can work on those challenges together is a key point for me. So the earlier we start the dialogue, the sooner we get those challenges on the table, the sooner we can find the ways through those things, because if we start in a siloed approach, then it is often involving a lot of unpicking later on down the line, and that's more difficult and resource intensive.
Thank you. Any comments before we move on to the next question, James?
Nothing from me there, Keith. I'm just really happy to hear both WLGA and NRW, you know, providing those answers, because it's exactly what we want to see.
Exactly. Thank you. Question from Alex. What can be done to ensure that Wales's future infrastructure developments contribute to a net reduction in flood risk, such as considering land requirements remote from main highway corridors to creating wider spaces for retaining water in upper catchments? Ceri, you first.
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? So, you know, there's a whole body of organisations that need to be involved in that planning, and I think, to be honest, it comes back to the point that James made earlier about looking further forward at what the sort of major infrastructure and spatial planning options are, looking at them in the round, so not looking at them sort of through a transport lens or a, you know, sort of you know, other infrastructure lens, but looking across them all to see where the synergies are and the opportunities are to deliver. You know, it's complex, this, isn't it? You know, it was, you know, back in the day, it seemed a lot easier when you were trying to just resolve a particular problem. But I think the nature of what we're trying to deal with here, which is, you know, sort of risk management, you know, sort of adaptation, and the nature crisis, means that we have got to look in the round, which does make it feel more complex. But as long as, you know, you've got the right people around the table, bring in their energy, their resources in terms of their, you know, their technical resources, as well as their, you know, sort of monetary resources, then that's got to be the way forward, so that we can look at, you know, where would those corridors for biodiversity be that can be sewn into those infrastructure developments from the outset, so that we are providing those connections and then enhancing the resilience of biodiversity, you know, looking for those nature-based solutions so that we've got, you know, the opportunity to slow the water, but deal with the carbon issues as well. You know, they've all got to be in the mix and on the table. So I think, you know, it comes back to the point that James is asking for, and that is that, you know, sort of more emphasis on that longer term strategic planning so that we can bring the right things together into our consideration.
Thank you. We know that many of our studies management infrastructure are owned by third parties. So any other comments, James?
Yeah, just reiterating that really, Keith. It is about looking wider. It's an excellent question really for an ICE conference, because I think this is a, you know, an engineering approach, it's a planning approach, and it's a flood and water management and land management approach. So, you know, the answer is let's bring all of those together. That's not easy. It's going to be incredibly difficult to do, but it's good that the questions are being asked, and it's in terms of our response, I can say that's exactly where government and NRW and local authorities are looking. We're trying to look wider than just the point and shoot. You know, there's a problem with this stream or this river, let's just go and fix that. We are looking up catchment, we're looking wider, and we're looking at better ways of managing the land. And we mentioned earlier, Jeremy mentioned sort of agricultural work as well, and working with landowners, farmers, and like you said, the likes of third-party utilities, infrastructure providers as well.
And from an ICE perspective, that's mirrored. We have an increasing emphasis on carbon zero and minimising the impact on climate change. Question now from Karen. We've talked a lot about collaboration this morning, including communities, but we've not mentioned the third or the voluntary sector. Where did the speakers, and James, who are you specifically mentioned now, James, see the third sector fitted in, from example, natural flood risk management to community engagement? As you're named, James, you first.
Sorry, struggling to unmute myself there. I'd like to encourage the voluntary sector, third sector, to come in, become engaged whenever they want to, and I think that's it's something for them to push themselves forward, but obviously as well it's for our flood risk management authorities to go and engage with them as well. So the minister talked about the importance of going out and talking with the communities and getting out there, and I think the third sector do an incredibly important job of bringing some of those communities and those voices together. So we should utilize them. We should take advantage of their knowledge and their skills and say, okay, we want to go and talk to schools, communities, we want to talk to certain communities, and can you help us? So that's the challenge back out to both the voluntary sector to engage with us more, but especially to our flood risk management authorities to utilise their skills.
Ceri, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I would, focus. I absolutely support everything that James has said there, and and also the private sector, because let's be frank, a lot of this land is in private ownership. Welsh Government Woodland Estate and the NNRs that we manage represent about 7% of the land in Wales. So there's a big amount to go for, isn't there? That's in agricultural use or private ownership. So I think for me, we work really closely with the ENGO sector, particularly around natural flood management, where they may undertake some of the activity for us. We may grant aid them to do some of that work if we feel that they're in a better position to do so. In some instances they own sites that we can sort of help and support them to help and support the overall aim. So absolutely key. Certainly when I talk about collaboration, it is everybody who's got skin in the game, not just, sort of the flood risk management authorities and the usual public sector suspects. It is everybody who's got skin in the game on a catchment scale that we need to be talking to, bringing to the table, and, agreeing who's best placed to act in the various facets of, whatever it is that we're developing going forward.
Thank you. Ray, at the heart of local government, engagement with the third sector. Any comments from you?
Sorry.
This engagement with the third or voluntary sector, right at the heart of what local authorities do. Any comments from you?
Yeah. Again, it is very, very important to listen to what everybody says, and third sectors, they do play an important part in our lives, particularly in local government. So listen, but Ceri and James, they certainly gave the replies that I would uphold.
Keith, you might be mute.
Sorry, we're running out of time. Just go for the last couple of questions. Apologies. Technical glitch at the last minute there. Let's talk about why is Welsh Government funding protection of golf clubs located on the coast? That's a specific question. Surely these are ideal locations for early adaptation and nature to take over once again. This create property resilience and carbon sinks. James, do you want to take that one?
Can I come in, please, there? I've already sent a private reply to the person. So what I actually said was that phase 3 abounds a golf course. In other words, the golf course is between the sea, but the most important part of it all was that the consultants recognised that the purpose of phase 3 is to protect the main railway line between Shrewsbury and Aberystwyth, and that's where the debate is of who are we going to have a railway line protected over the bog, or aren't we? The golf course is just an aside.
Okay, we'll move on from that question. Two last questions and before we close down, as we are really running out of time. A lot of talk about a strategic approach to flooding, but is there a challenge? But there is a challenge of delivering schemes or other measures based on forecast of future risk. The public are suspicious of experts and forecasts, and this is being fed by social media. This makes it very difficult to undertake preemptive measures. Who wants to take that question?
Well, I'll give it a go to start off with, and perhaps others can add to it, and I think I hinted at, the difficulties really of the challenge to some of the evidence and some of the, the business cases that we've experienced, and this seems to be more of a growing trend of late than we've previously experienced. But again, I think, at the end of the day, we're public authorities, we're spending public money, and we have to be able to set out clearly and transparently how that looks, and that it's understandable to the public to see. We need to find ways to be able to share our evidence and our assessments such that they are clear and transparent. We're happy to be challenged, just to ensure that we haven't missed anything, that there may be other ways of looking at things, and there may be other actors who we can involve in the proposals that we take forward. So for me, it's recognizing that that is a challenge, and but that we're up for it. We will share our evidence, our business cases, and the assumptions that we're making, and we will listen to the challenges that we receive, because they're good points for us to check that we have made the right decisions and are putting the right things forward. So that's where I would start with that one.
Thank you. James, can we just go to the last question? As Ceri has answered one, nature-based solutions are an excellent option to lower level flood events, but are they able to cope with the extreme events? Nature has its way to deal with extreme events, but we've built on it.
Yep, certainly. We can't just ignore, what we want to put forward. We've set our case for natural flood management. We want to be using the land in a better way to manage flows, slow the flows. We haven't built on every inch of floodplain, I would say, and I would like to think that the new TAN 15 is trying to restrict that kind of direction. I think the old TAN 15 did a good job, and I think the new TAN 15 will do an even better job of restricting that. And we've got a very strong policy in the national strategy around prevention to try and make this better going forward, and TAN 15 is a huge part of that. But natural flood management is part of our policy, and it's here to stay. So we're funding those potential schemes at 100%. And no, it will not answer. It won't, stop all flood risk. But then again, neither will a wall. And there's very little we can do to stop what nature wants to do. And managing climate change is incredibly difficult, and there are certain things and interventions we can take forward which are an engineering approach, which can provide a certain standard of protection and can do a certain job. But I think a question was posed earlier but not answered about what's the standard of protection that we'd recommend. And the strategy says we don't propose a set standard of protection, but we do think there's a certain limit, 1 in 100 for rivers, 1 in 200 for coast, which is useful as a barometer, but that won't defend everybody either. So it's a mix. So we've got natural flood management in some catchments, we've got hard defences in others, and in other places there's a need to adapt. There maybe a need to move away from certain areas of high risk, as happened in Merthyr Vale just a couple of years ago, where certain houses were demolished, sadly, but it was done for public safety, and it was done to move people out of danger. Now there's a whole range of approaches we can take across Wales, and there's not one particular answer, but using natural flood alleviation and natural solutions is certainly part of the answer, certainly part of the mix anyway.
Thank you.
And Keith, if I could add, the only thing I would add to what James has said there, because I absolutely support that, is, people understanding their flood risk as well, because, that's the other pillar of this, isn't it? Is that we will do as much as we can through all of those things that James has said, but every individual needs to understand their personal flood risk, where they're living, and then have a plan about how they're going to respond if the worst happens, because, the rivers are there, the coast is there, and we can see the risks from those, but we're all at risk from surface water flooding, and we've seen time and time again with monsoon type rain events that surface water flooding is the thing that's causing the problem. So we all need to understand that we're at risk of that.
Thank you. Heather has replied about her question about tax break for water neutrality. and she adds to it for not releasing water into the already overloaded drainage system. Is that a policy matter for Welsh Government? Probably would have been better for the Minister, or do you want to make any comment, James?
I think our stance on sustainable drainage solutions is really helpful. We've taken a stronger stance than England on SUDs. That's a policy which is evolving, and we're looking at making that sort of tightening that where necessary. So that's a wait and see and watch and see where we're going with that policy. But we're certainly quite strong on trying to reduce the flows coming from built development and from urban areas. I don't really want to go into the tax breaks discussion. I think the finance discussions are quite difficult, and some of those areas are not devolved to Welsh Government. But certainly our policy on sustainable drainage and working with both water companies and local authorities around drainage and reducing that runoff is pivotal to our policy and strategy. Thank you. Well, I think we've run out of time. Thanks on behalf of the steering group for this joint conference, ICE Welsh Cymru, in conjunction with the Chartered Institution of Water Environmental Management, supported by Arab, Atkins, Binnie's, JB Consulting, Waterco. I'd like to thank them all for the support. Thanks to our speakers, for the Minister who's with us today, Kelly Davies, and Councillor Ray Grant, and James for chipping in as well. Thank you very much. This event is being recorded. It will be available on the ICE website in about a week or so, as soon as we can get the editing done. I'd like to thank you all and look forward to continuing the second session tomorrow at 9 o'clock and the third session then the day after. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, and good luck for the next couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.